I'm now switching over to World Civilizations, the Global Experience, 6th edition. And it's still the AP edition, however, it's not the combined volume. But this is the one that's used at classical high school, and as far as I'm concerned, is used to develop the AP exam. But anyway, Part 3, the Post-Classical Period, 500 to 1450, New Faith and New Commerce. The overview. The world map changes. The big changes in the period 500 to 1450 did not involve political boundaries. They involved the spread of the major world religions, Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam, across political and cultural borders, and the development of new, more regular systems of trade that connected much of Asia, Africa, and Europe. In some ways, an age characterized by faith and trade may have seemed contradictory. Indeed, many religious leaders looked down on merchants as likely to be seduced from a life of piety by the lure of wealth. But in fact, the spread of trade often helped disseminate religion, and confidence in the divine order helped merchants to take risks. The map included here shows the surge of Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam from their initial centers and the expansion of Afro-Eurasian trade around the same period. While Buddhism and Christianity started well before this period, they gained new vigor as the classical empire collapsed. Islam, which spread most rapidly, was entirely new. All three religions involved active missionary efforts. All periodically benefited from the government sponsorship and sometimes from military pressure as well. For example, conquerors might impose higher taxes on those they conquered who did not convert to the conqueror's religion, or they might forcibly expel non-believers from the territory. Through a combination of persuasion and pressure, many millions of people changed their beliefs about the world around them and about the goals of life. The religious beliefs they adopted during the post-classical period established the dominant religious frameworks that still prevail in Asia, Europe, and parts of Africa today. During the post-classical period, systematic international trade developed that went far beyond the carrying capacity of the Silk Road. The Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea were the hubs of this trade, which brought northwestern Europe, West Africa, Japan, and other regions into the existing east-west trade routes between China and Egypt. Gradually and tentatively, these connections among societies, rather than separate developments within societies, began to shape world history in important ways. Big concepts. Along with, and partly because of religious change, three big concepts helped organize the understanding of the post-classical period. First, trans-regional communication and exchange networks expanded with the important new routes added. Missionary activity and new seafaring technologies both contributed to this. Second, forms of state organization diversified with centralized empires now juxtaposed to a variety of looser political structures. Third, several societies headed by China increased their productive capacity with social sequences extending to the emergence of new urban centers and the experimentation with different forms of labor. Triggers for change. As its name indicates, the post-classical period followed the decline of the great classical empires. As areas that had previously been under the control of these empires experienced economic decline and increasing disorder, people turned toward religious faith for security, reassurance, and guidance. A second effect of the decline of the classical empires was the collapse of established boundaries, which caused ambitious people to turn their attention to new areas. The fall of the Roman Empire, for example, opened up new opportunities in the eastern Mediterranean, most notably for the Arabs, When the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, could not regain lost territories in the Mediterranean, it turned its attention to opportunities in Russia and Eastern Europe. These reorientations encouraged missionary activity and trade alike. Expanding trade encouraged the development of better ships and new navigational devices. This was another trigger for change as the post-classical period moved along. The Chinese invented the compass, and from the Middle East came better ship designs. Maps also improved as a result of wider trade. They, in turn, encouraged further travel. The same held true for new banking and commercial practices. Long-distance credit arrangements, for example, facilitated international exchange. The big changes. Religion and commerce were the engines of chance in the post-classical period. Changes in their own right. They were the causes of many other changes. Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam were the religions that showed the greatest capacity to spread beyond the cultures in which they arose. Their spread created larger groups of people with broadly shared beliefs and religious institutions than ever before. This generated new opportunities for mutual intolerance. Many Christians and Muslims particularly developed disdain for each other, but also examples of constructive tolerance. Under Islamic rule, Iberia, or what is present-day Spain and Portugal, became a center of creative interaction among Muslims, Christians, and Jews. Religion also created new loyalties that could compete with other values, including political values, and political issues on the whole received less attention. Wait, let me reread that sentence. Religion also created new loyalties that could compete with other values, including political values, and political issues on the whole received less attention during this period than in the classical era. While the spread of otherworldly religion generally was a major theme, it was obvious that during these centuries Islam developed a particular dynamism that affected more different cultures and peoples than the other religions. All major societies in Asia, Europe, and Africa reacted to the spread of missionary religions in this period, and all reacted to some extent to the power of Islam. Religion, however, meant different things to different people, even with the same faith. The number of devoted religious communities and leaders increased. For example, with monastic movements in Buddhism and Christianity. Economic contributions to religious institutions sometimes outstripped tax payments to governments. But many people combine religion with other interests, including commercial life. And most people combine new religions with older values and artistic forms. I read that wrong. And most peoples combine new religions with older values and artistic forms. The development of regular trade created a coherent world network joining key parts of Asia, Africa, and Europe. The most sophisticated exchanges linked the most prosperous and urbanized societies of the era. China, India, the Middle East, and North America, and the Byzantine Empire traded manufactured goods of various sorts, mainly for elite customers interested in silks and porcelains, spelled porcelains. It's spelled Porcelains. North-south trade routes linked sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, Japan, northeastern Europe, and Russia to this commercial network. These areas provided less processed goods, including gold and slaves. Trade facilitated the spread of technologies. A number of Chinese inventions, first paper, when Islamic troops captured some papermakers in western China. Then printing and explosives spread to the Middle East and on to Europe. Early in the post-classical period, this exchange was very slow, though faster than in previous centuries, but it became more rapid as time went on. In the end of the post-classical period, key Chinese inventions like printing and explosives moved westward more swiftly. Ideas spread as well. Thanks to trade, Indian mathematics, including the number system, spread to the Middle East. The Arab mathematics, blending earlier Greek and Indian achievements with Arab innovations, reached Western Europe. The spread of disease accelerated as well. In the 14th century, a new epidemic of bubonic plague, the Black Death, moved from China through the Middle East to Europe, killing up to a third of the population in many areas. The international trade of the post-classical era was not what we think of as a world economy today. Fewer societies were involved, and the volume and range of trade was far lower. However, despite downsides like disease, the international exchange of the post-classical era had major effects. Along with religion, trade opportunities and merchants' interests became themes that had to be dealt with by each major society in Afro-Eurasia. The transcontinental network. We live today in a period of rapidly intensifying contacts among all the world's major societies, and the process is increasingly referred to as globalization. Globalization has many new features, starting with dramatic communication technologies like the Internet. We increasingly realize, however, that contemporary globalization was prepared by previous periods in which interactions among major regions expanded. The post-classical period marked a major separation between earlier eras in which contacts among different regions were slow or occasional, into a situation in which trade, travel, and exchange created significant new, often routinized influences on the ways individual societies developed. The key process involved a series of routes for trade and travel that formed a new transcontinental network. The term network sums up the real innovations in contacts among the societies of Africa, Asia, and Europe, accurately suggesting the seeds of the high level of interaction we experience today. Defining the relationship between the systems of interaction in the post-classical period and later patterns provides a key way to map the process of change in world history. The transcontinental network itself compelled many societies in Afro-Eurasia to decide on how to organize their participation in trade and exchange, and how to take advantage of the opportunities involved. No society responded in exactly the same way. Comparing responses is an obvious assignment in analyzing the post-classical period, and some societies changed their responses over time. The spread of world religions, which created huge new areas of shared faith, but also new divisions among religions themselves, contributed to but also complicated the evolution of the transcontinental network. Continuity. Change, including the formation of the transcontinental network, inevitably affected different societies to different degrees. Continuities combined with change. Even though the classical empires had collapsed, the successes of classical civilization encouraged many people to maintain or revive classical forms. China eagerly revived the structures of its classical age, including the empire, the bureaucracy, and Confucianism. It was touched by Islam and Buddhism, but ultimately it limited the influence of outside religions. China was not a changeless society. Its growing participation in interregional trade proved its capacity to take advantage of new opportunities, but continuity remained extremely important. The Middle East underwent great change as a result of the rise of Islam, but it also maintained continuities. Hellenistic science interacted with Islam, leading to important philosophical discussions of the relationship between science and faith. Earlier practices, such as the veiling of women in the cities, were revived. Although Islam opposed the enslavement of fellow Muslims, slavery continued to be a major component of social and labor systems over much of Afro-Eurasia. This marked a revival of traditions of the Greek and Roman world. Continuities also showed in the blending of traditional forms with the missionary religions. Christian architecture had long used Greco-Roman styles. Buddhism adapted to Chinese values, for example, by placing more emphasis on the family loyalties of women. But no systematic changes in social structures or even political forms occurred during the post-classical centuries. The expansion of a merchant class affected social structure, but landlords remained dominant in most societies, and peasants made up the bulk of the population. In key areas, slavery, or in India, the caste system also maintained or revived older social institutions. Large political units developed in a few places, but outside of China, polities, spelled Polities, were mainly loosely organized. Finally, major areas were not part of the system shaped by world religions and interregional trade. Most notably, the Americas and Pacific Oceania, through scenes of significant developments, operated on separate dynamics and had a few, if any, contacts with the rest of the world. Impact on daily life. Women. The post-classical period saw an intriguing tension that affected conditions for women in many parts of Afro-Eurasia. On the one hand, the major religions all insisted that women were spiritually equal to men, that they had souls or shared in the divine essence. This was a huge innovation, and religious change was not a matter of ideals alone. Buddhist leaders in Japan argued for women's importance. Islam established new rights for women, including property ownership. Buddhism and Christianity both established religious communities for women, giving them not only new forms of expression, but also new leadership roles. As these religions spread, many women gained new positions and modes of expression through religious life. On the other hand, the condition of women also deteriorated during this period. Many scholars have argued that growing trade and urban prosperity reduced women's role in political and economic life and created conditions in which upper-class women were treated as ornaments. So, although religion helped women, it may have also distracted them from other issues. As they found spiritual solace, trade may have contributed to new gender inequalities. Other changes were less favorable to women. Foot binding, the clearest attempt to make women more purely ornamental, spread in China. In India, the practice of sati, spelled S-A-T-I, in which some widows threw themselves on their husband's funeral pyres to demonstrate their grief, developed during this period. As Islamic society matured in the Middle East, women were increasingly secluded and excluded from active roles in public life. But in other Islamic societies, especially in Africa, this was less true. At the same time, most historians conclude that the condition of women in Western Europe had deteriorated by the later post-classical period, as judged, for example, by their greater exclusion from most skilled urban crafts. Thus, the post-classical period was an important one in women's history. New religions were important to many women, but new customs were also limited opportunities for women to be a greater degree than in the classical era. In much of the world, at least the vestiges of these limitations survive to the present day. Trends and societies in the early modern period. Chapters 6 and 7 examine the surge of Islam, first in the Middle East and then in other parts of Asia. Chapter 8 describes the expansion of trade and civilization in sub-Saharan Africa, which had various facets, but the link to Islam and the Islamic trading system was crucial. Two dynamics developed in Europe. Each had contacts, both creative and hostile, with Islam and certainly with interregional trade. In Eastern Europe, as detailed in Chapter 9, Byzantine culture took root, while a newer society emerged in Western Europe, as described in Chapter 10. Chapter 11 describes the major cultures that developed in the Americas and contacts among them. Chapters 12 and 13 address developments in China and expansion of Chinese influence in Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, key parts of the network of interregional trade. The last 2 centuries of the post-classical period, as Arab power declined, saw important new developments. Chapter 14 describes the Mongol conquest in the 13th and 14th centuries that, for a time, revolutionized the political map of Asia and parts of Europe, accelerating and redefining interregional trade and other exchanges. The decline of the Mongols and the end of a brief Chinese experiment in leading world trade left the world poised for further innovation. Chapter 15 describes a transitional movement and the complex factors that would alter world balance yet again. Chapter 6. The First Global Civilization, the Rise and Spread of Islam. In any ranking of the greatest survivors in world history, Abdel Rahman, I would have to be near or at the top of the list. The grandson of the last distinguished Caliph, spelled Caliph, leader of the Muslim faithful, of the Umayyad dynasty, he had barely survived the vengeful slaughter of many male descendants of that first house of Muslim rulers by the warriors of the Abbasid, spelled Abbasid, coalition that had seized power in 749. After narrowly escaping capture and beheading on his estate on the upper Euphrates River, Abdel Rahman, dodging Abbasid pursuers and bounty hunters alike, fled through Syria and Palestine and across North Africa. After half a decade as fugitive, he finally found uneasy sanctuary in Morocco at the western end of the lands to which Islam had spread to that point in time. In 755, the 24-year-old crossed the narrow straits of Gibraltar, spelled Gibraltar, that separated North Africa from the Iberian Peninsula. Rallying to his cause several hundred Syrians, whose homelands had been the mainstay of the vanquished Umayyad dynasty and who had joined in earlier Arab Berber campaigns to conquer the peninsula. Abdel Rahman began his quest to become master of Iberia. Iberia is spelled Iberia. Despite continuing resistance by rivals and rebels from within and invasions plotted by Abbasid rulers in distant Baghdad, Abdel Rahman steadily consolidated his control over Iberia. His early victories, particularly the capture of Cordoba in 756, secured his position as the paramount lord in the peninsula within years of his arrival. In the following decades, as the capital of a flourishing Muslim kingdom, Cordoba grew rapidly into one of the most cosmopolitan and celebrated cities in the Mediterranean world. Cordoba boasted well-paved and well-lit streets, houses with running water, one of the world's finest universities, and a library with over 400,000 volumes at a time when the largest collections in Christian Europe contained 1,000 at best. But Cordoba's crowning glory was its great mosque Mosque, spelled Mosque. It was famed for its hundreds of splendid marble columns topped by ornate horseshoe arches and its elaborately decorated vaulted ceilings, shown here, figure 6.1. But even more remarkable than its distinctive architecture and decoration were the ways in which the mosque encapsulated the exceptional synergy generated by cooperation among and the blending of the diverse peoples and cultures that came together in Islamic Spain. Like the development of Muslim civilization, more generally, the construction of the Great Mosque of Cordoba owed much to earlier and even contemporary rival civilizations. It was built on the ruins of a Christian church, and many of the pillars that supported the signature horseshoe arches were taken from Roman ruins. And though the influence of Syrian-style Islamic architecture is apparent, the mosque's bell tower and thick walls decorated with geometric stone carvings shared key features with the Roman's Q, spelled Romanesque churches then found throughout Latin Christendom, spelled Christendom. Much of Mosque's stonework, and especially its intricate mosaics, were crafted by Christian Orthodox artisans from Constantinople, and its architects, laborers, and overseers were drawn from Arab and Berber Muslim immigrants as well as the majority Christian population of Iberia. The cross-cultural influences and interethnic and religious cooperation that played such vital roles in the construction of the Grand Mosque of Cordoba were also prominent features of Muslim Iberian society as a whole. Under the Muslims, the peninsula became a key locus for the transmission of ideas, technology, and material culture between the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. Arab and Berber migrants brought paper, originally invented, as we have seen in China, and refined steelworking to Al-Andalus, spelled Al-Andalus. And their descendants carried leather working skills back to Morocco and the border Muslim world. Muslim migrants to Iberia also introduced sophisticated irrigation systems and a wide variety of staple foods and plants, including oranges, sugarcane, and cotton. Jews and Christians, as people of the book, were allowed in Iberia, as in the rest of the Muslim world, to worship openly, to regulate their everyday lives according to their own laws, and to collaborate with Muslims in trade, scholarship, and the arts. Arab and Jewish scholars in Cordoba, Sevilla, and other urban centers, for example, were renowned throughout the Mediterranean for their translations of classic Greek texts. By the 10th and 11th centuries, their collaboration had become pivotal for the recovery in Latin Christendom of the writings of the great Greek philosopher and scientist Aristotle in such critical areas as astronomy, mathematics, geography, and meteorology. Muslim Spain was also a key source of the tradition of wandering minstrels or troubadours who carried music, fables, and the notion of romantic love northward into Christian Europe. And upper-class, educated women, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish, flourished as poets, musicians, scribes, and university students. In the chapter that follows, we shall see that in many ways Muslim Iberia was a microcosm microcosm spelled MICROCOSM, albeit spelled ALBEIT, a very forward-looking one of much of the Islamic world in its early centuries. I think that's it, albeit a very forward-looking one of much of the Islamic world in its early centuries. He's just squashed all together. I've never seen it written like that before. Alright, anyway, back to the book. Though spread initially mainly by nomadic camel-herding peoples of Arabia, Islam was from its inception a religion of the towns and trade. Muhammad himself was a successful caravan leader before he began to receive the divine revelations that transformed him into the founder of one of the great world religions. As in Iberia, conversion to Islam as it spread from Arabia was generally peaceful and voluntary, and in the early decades the faithful were, if anything, reluctant to recruit new believers. Even after the new faith came to undergird vast and expansive empires, such as those fashioned by the Umayyads and Abbasids, adherents of other religions based on divinity-inspired scriptures, from the Jews and Christians to the Hindus, prayed and practiced their rituals openly, and their communities were often flourished economically. As had been the case in Iberia, many of the most brilliant contributions of early Islamic civilization came from the openness of Arabs to borrowing from the ancient and rich civilizations that surrounded the Arab heartlands. Their absorption and then innovations on the sciences, arts, and technologies of Greece, Rome, Byzantium, Persia, Egypt, India, and China were essential to the rise of the first genuinely global civilization in human history. Desert and town, the pre-Islamic Arabian world. The Arabian Peninsula, map 6.1, was a very unlikely birthplace for the first global civilization. Much of the area is covered by some of the most inhospitable desert in the world, and an early traveler wrote of the region, "All about us is an iron wilderness, a bare and black shining beach of heated volcanic stones, a vast bed and banks of rusty and basaltic bluish rocks, stubborn as heavy matter, as iron and sounding like bell metal, lying out eternally under the sand-driving desert wind. In the scrub zones on the edges of the empty quarters or uninhabitable desert zones, a wide variety of Bedouin or nomadic cultures had developed over the centuries, based on camel and goat herding. In oases like that pictured in figure 6.2, which dotted the dry landscape, towns and agriculture flourished on a limited scale. Only in the coastal regions of the far south had extensive agriculture, sizable cities, and regional kingdoms developed in ancient times. Over much of the rest of the peninsula, the camel nomads, organized in tribes and clans, were dominant. Yet in the rocky regions adjacent to the Red Sea, several trading towns had developed that played pivotal roles in the emergence of Islam. Although the urban roots of Islam have been stressed by writers on Muslim civilization, the Bedouin world in which the religion arose shaped the career of its prophet, his teachings, and the spread of the new beliefs. In fact, key towns such as Mecca, Mecca is spelled Mecca, I think that's how it's pronounced, and Medina were largely extensions of the tribal culture of the camel nomads. Their populations were linked by kinship to Bedouin peoples. Sorry, I'm going to reread that sentence. Their populations were linked by kingship to Bedouin peoples. For example, Mecca had been founded by Bedouins and at the time of Muhammad was ruled by former Bedouin clans. The safety of the trade routes on which the towns depended was in the hands of the nomadic tribes that lived along the vulnerable caravan routes to the north and south. In addition, the town dwellers' social organization, which focused on clan and family and their culture, including language and religion, were much like those of the nomads. Clan identity, clan rivalries, and the cycle of vengeance. The harsh desert and scrub environment of Arabia gave rise to forms of social organization and a lifestyle that were similar to those of other nomadic peoples. Bedouin herders lived in kin-related clan groups in highly mobile tent encampments. Clans, in turn, were clustered in larger tribal groupings, but these were rarely congregated together, and then only in times of war or severe crisis. The struggle for subsistence in the unforgiving Arabian environment resulted in a strong dependence on and loyalty to one's family and clan. Survival depended on cooperation with and support from kin. To be cut off from them or expelled from the clan encampment was in most cases fatal. The use of watering places and grazing lands, which were essential to maintaining the herds on which Bedouin life depended, was regulated by clan councils, but there would be wide disparities of wealth and status within clan groups and between clans of the same tribe. Though normally elected by councils of elders, the shaykhs, spelled Shaykhs, of leaders of the tribes and clans were almost always men with large herds, several wives, many children, and numerous retainers. The shaykhs' dictates were enforced by bands of free warriors whose families made up a majority of a given clan group. Beneath the warriors were slave families, often the remnants of rival clans defeated in war, who served the shaykhs or the clan as a whole. Clan cohesion was reinforced by fierce interclan rivalries and struggles to control vital pasture lands and watering places. If the warriors from one clan found those from another clan drawing water from one of their wells, they were likely to kill them. Wars often broke out as a result of one clan encroaching on the pasture areas of another clan. In a culture in which one's honor depended on respect for another clan, for one's clan, the flimsiest pretext could lead to interclan violence. For instance, an insult to a warrior in a market town, the theft of a prize stallion, or one clan's defeat in a horse race by another clan could end in battles between clan groups. All the men of a given clan joined in these fights, which normally were won by the side that could field several champions who were famed for their strength and skill with spears or bows and arrows. These battles were fought according to a code of chivalry that was quite common in early cultures. Although battles usually were small in terms of the numbers involved, they were hard fought and often bloody affairs. Almost invariably, the battles either initiated or perpetuated clan feuds, which could continue for hundreds of years. The deaths of the warriors of one clan required that revenge to be taken on the clan that had killed them. Their deaths led in turn to reprisals, spelled Reprisals. This constant infighting weakened the Bedouins in relation to the neighboring peoples and empires and allowed them to be manipulated and set against each other. Towns and long-distance trade. Although Bedouin herders occupied most of the inhabitable portions of Arabian of Arabia, farmers and town dwellers carved out small communities in the western and southern parts of the peninsula in the classical era. Foreign invasions and the inroads of Bedouin peoples had all but destroyed the civilization centuries before the birth of Muhammad. But a number of cities had developed farther north as links in the transcontinental trading system that had stretched from the Mediterranean to East Asia. The most important of these cities was Mecca, located in the mountainous region along the Red Sea on the west coast of Arabia, map 6.1. The town had been founded by the Umayyad clan of the Quraysh, spelled Quraysh, Bedouin tribe, and members of the clan dominated its politics and commercial economy. The wealth and status of Mecca and its merchant elite were enhanced by the fact that the city was the site of the Kaaba, one of the most revered religious shrines in pre-Islamic Arabia. Not only did the shrine attract pilgrims and customers from Mecca's bazaars, but at certain times of the year, it was the focus of obligatory truce in the interclan feuds. Freed from fears of assault by rival groups, merchants and Bedouins flocked to the town to trade, exchange gossip, and taste the delights of city life. Northeast of Mecca was a town named Yathrib, map 6.1, that later came to be known as Medina, or the city of the Prophet Muhammad. Like most of the other towns in the peninsula, Medina was established in an oasis. Wells and springs made sedentary agriculture possible. In addition to wheat and other staples, Medina's inhabitants grew date palms, whose fruit and seeds, which were fed to camels, were traded to the Bedouins. Medina was also engaged, though on a much smaller scale than Mecca, in the long-distance caravan trade that passed through Arabia. In contrast to Umayyad-dominated Mecca, controlled in Medina was contested by 2 Bedouin and 3 Jewish clans. Their quarrels left the city in a poor second to Mecca as a center of trade, and these divisions proved critical to the survival of the Prophet Muhammad and the Islamic faith. Marriage and family in pre-Islamic Arabia. Although the evidence is scant, there are several indications that women in pre-Islamic Arabia Bedouin culture enjoyed greater freedom and higher status than those who lived in neighboring civilized centers, such as the Byzantine and Sasanian empires that dominated the Middle East, map 6.1. Women played key economic roles from milking camels and weaving cloth to raising children. Because the men of the clan were often on the move, many tribes traced descent through the mother rather than the father. In some tribes, both men and women were allowed multiple marriage partners. To seal a marriage contract, the man was required to pay a bride price to his prospective wife's family, rather than the woman's father sending a dowry or gift to the prospective husband. Unlike the women, especially those of an elite status, in neighboring Syria and Persia, women in pre-Islamic Arabia were not secluded and did not wear veils. Their advice was highly regarded in clan and tribal councils, and they often composed poems that were the focus of Bedouin cultural life in the pre-Islamic era. Despite those career outlets, women were not by any means considered equal to men. They could not gain glory as warriors, the most prized occupation of the Bedouins, and often they were little more than drudge laborers. Their status depended on the custom of individual clans and tribes rather than on legal codes. As a result, it varied widely from one clan or family to the next. Customary practices of property control, inheritance, and divorce heavily favored men. In the urban environment of trading centers such as Mecca, the rise of mercantile elite and social stratification appeared to have set back the position of women on the whole. The more stable family life of the towns led to the practice of tracing descent through the male line, and while men continued to practice polygamy, women were expected to be monogamous. poets and neglected gods. Because of the isolation of Arabia in the pre-Islamic age and the harshness and poverty of the natural environment, Arab material culture was not highly developed, except in the far south. There was little art or architecture of worth. Even Mecca made little impression on the cosmopolitan merchants who passed through the city in caravans from fabled cities of the ancient civilizations farther north. The main focus of Bedouin cultural creativity in the Islamic era was poetry, which was composed and transmitted orally because there was as yet no written language. Clan and tribal bards narrated poems that told of their kinsmen's heroics in war and the clan's great deeds. Some poets were said to have magical powers and to be possessed by demons. More than any other source, poems provide a vision of life and society in pre-Islamic Arabia. They tell of lovers spurned and passion consummated, spelled Consummated, war and vendettas. I'm going to restart that sentence. They tell of lovers spurned and passion consummated, war and vendettas, loyalty and generosity. Bedouin religion was foremost clans of. Sorry, I'm going to restart that sentence. Bedouin religion was for most clans a blend of animism and polytheism, or the worship of many gods and goddesses. Some tribes, such as the Quraysh, recognized a supreme god named Allah, spelled A-L-L-A-H, but they seldom prayed or sacrificed to Allah, concentrating instead on less abstract spirits who seemed more relevant to their daily lives. Both spirits and gods, for example, the moon god, Hubal, tended to be associated with night, a cool period when dew covered the earth, which had been parched by the blaze of the desert sun. Likewise, the worship of nature spirits focused on sacred caves, pure springs, and groves of trees, places where the Bedouins could take shelter from the heat and wind. Religion appears to have little to do with ethics, rather than the standards of morality and proper behavior which rooted in tribal customs and unwritten codes of honor. How seriously the Bedouins took their gods is also a matter of some doubt. Their lukewarm adherence is illustrated by the famous tale of a Bedouin warrior who set out to revenge his father's death at the hands of a rival clan. He stopped at an oracle along the way to seek advice by drawing arrows that indicated various courses of action he might take. 3 times he drew arrows that advised him to abandon his quest for revenge. Infuriated by this counsel, he hurled the arrows at the idol of the oracle and exclaimed, "Accursed one, had it been thy father who was murdered, thou would not have been forbidden my avenging him." The life of Muhammad and the genesis of Islam. By the 6th century CE, camel nomads were dominant throughout much of Arabia. The civilized centers of the south were in ruins, and trading centers such as Mecca and Medina depended on alliances with neighboring Bedouin tribes to keep the caravan routes open. The constricted world of clan and kin, nomadic camp, blood feud, and local gods persisted despite the lure of the empires and cosmopolitan urban centers that stretched in a great arc to the north and east of the Arabian Peninsula. See map 6.1. But pressures for changes were mounting. Both the Byzantine and Sasanian empires struggled to assert greater control over the nomadic tribes of the peninsula. In addition, Arab peoples migrated into Mesopotamia and other areas to the north, where they came increasingly under foreign influence. From these regions, the influence of established monotheistic religions, especially Judaism and Christianity, entered Arabia. These These new currents gave rise to a number of Arab prophets who urged the Bedouin tribes to renounce idol worship and rely on a single Almighty God. The Prophet Muhammad and new religion that his revelations inspired in the early decades of the 7th century responded both to these influences following into Arabia and to related social dislocations that were disrupting Arab life. The hardships of Muhammad's early life underscore the importance of clan ties in the Arabian world. He was born around 570 CE into a prominent clan of the Quraysh tribe, the Banu Hashim, in a Bedouin encampment where he spent the first 6 years of his life. Because his father died before he was born, Muhammad was raised by his father's relatives. The loss of his father was compounded by the death of Muhammad's mother shortly after he went to live with her some years later. Despite these early losses, Muhammad had the good fortune to be born into a respected clan and powerful tribe. His paternal uncle, Abu Talib, was particularly fond of the boy and served as his protector and supporter through much of his early life. Muhammad's grandfather, who like other leading members of the clan was engaged in commerce, educated the young man in the ways of the merchant. With Abu Talib, Muhammad made his first caravan journey to Syria, where on this and later trips he met adherents of the Christian and Jewish faiths, whose beliefs and practices had a great impact on his teachings. In his adolescence, Muhammad took up residence in Mecca. By his early 20s, he was working as a trader for Khadijah, spelled Khadijah, the widow of a wealthy merchant, whom he married some years later. His life as a merchant in Mecca and on the caravan routes exposed Muhammad to the world beyond Arabia and probably made him acutely aware of the clan rivalries that had divided the peoples of the region for millennia. He would also have become increasingly concerned about new forces undermining solidarity within the clans. The growth of the towns and trade had enriched some clan families and left others behind, often in poverty. It had also introduced a new source of tension between clan and tribal groupings because some clans, such as the Umayyads, grew rich on the profits from commerce, whereas others maintained herding lifestyle. As a trader and traveler, Muhammad would almost certainly have been aware of the new religious currents that were sweeping Arabia and surrounding areas in the early 7th century. Particularly notable among these was the spread of monotheistic ideas and a growing dissatisfaction with the old gods that had been venerated by the Bedouin peoples. In Muhammad's time, several prophets had arisen, proclaiming a new faith for the Arabs. Through socially prominent, economically well-off, and widely admired for his trading skills and trustworthiness, Muhammad grew increasingly distracted and dissatisfied with a life focus that surrounded Mecca. In 610 or earlier, he received the first of many revelations which his followers believed Allah transmitted to him through the angel Gabriel. These revelations were later written in Arabic and collected in the Quran, spelled Quran. The teachings and injunctions of the Quran formed the basis of the new religion that Muhammad began to preach to his clan and the people of Mecca. Persecution, flight, and victory. At first, Muhammad's following was small, consisting mainly of his wife, several clanspeople, and some servants and slaves. As his message was clarified with successive revelations, the circle of the faithful grew, so that the Umayyad notables who who dominated Meccan life, saw him as a threat to their own wealth and power. Above all, new faith threatened to supplant the gods of the Kaaba, whose shrines had done so much to establish the city as a center of commerce and Bedouin interchange. Although he was protected for a time by his own clan, Muhammad was increasingly threatened by the Umayyads, who plotted with other clans to murder him. It was clear that Muhammad must flee Mecca, but where was he going to find refuge? Muhammad's reputation as a skillful and fair negotiator prepared the way for his success flight from Umayyad persecution. The quarrels between the clans in the nearby city of Medina had set off increasingly violent clashes, and the Oasis community was on the verge of civil war. Leaders in the Bedouin clans in Medina sent a delegation to invite Muhammad, who was related to them on his mother's side, to mediate their disputes and put an end to the strife that had plagued the town. Clever ruses, spelled R-U-S-E-S, and the courage of his clansman Ali, who at one point took Muhammad's place and thus risked becoming the target of assassins, secured in 622 the safe passage of Muhammad and a small band of followers from Mecca to Medina. His Hijra, spelled Hijra, or flight to Medina, marks the first year of the Islamic calendar. In Medina, he was given a hero's welcome. He soon justified this warm reception by deftly settling the quarters between the Bedouin clans of the towns. His wisdom and skills as a political leader won him new followers who joined those who had accompanied him from Mecca as the core believers of the new faith. In the eyes of the Umayyad notables, Muhammad's success made him a greater threat than ever. Not only was he preaching a faith that rivaled their own, but his leadership was strengthening Mecca's competitor, Medina. Muslim raids on Meccan caravans provided yet another source of danger. Determined to put an end to these threats, the Quraysh launched a series of attacks in the mid-620s on Muhammad and his followers in Medina. These attacks led to several battles. In these clashes, Muhammad provided an able leader and courageous fighter. The ultimate victory for Muhammad and his followers was signaled by a treaty with the Quraysh in 628, which included a provision granting the Muslims permission to visit the shrine at Kaaba in Mecca during the season of truce. By then, Muhammad's community had won many Bedouin allies, and more than 10,000 converts accompanied him on his triumphal return to his hometown in 629. After proving the power of Allah, the single God he proclaimed, by smashing the idols of the shrine, Muhammad gradually won over the Umayyads and most of the other inhabitants of Mecca to the new faith. Arabs and Islam. Although Islam was soon to become one of the great world religions, the beliefs and practices of the Prophet Muhammad were initially adopted only by the Arab town dwellers and Bedouins among whom he had grown up. There is a striking parallel here with early Christianity, which focused on Jewish converts. The new religion preached by Muhammad had much to offer the divided peoples of Arabia. It gave them a form of monotheism that belonged to no single tribe and transcended clan and class divisions. It provided a religion that was distinctly Arab in origin and yet the equal of the monotheistic faiths held by the Christian and Jews who lived in the midst of Bedouin tribes. If anything, the monotheism preached by Muhammad was even more uncompromising than that of the Christians because it allowed no intermediaries between individual and God. God was one, there were no saints, and angels were nothing more than messengers. In addition, there were no priests in Christian or Jewish sense of the term. Islam offered the possibility of an end to the vendettas and feuds that had so long divided the peoples of Arabia and that undermined their attempts to throw off the domination of neighboring empires. The Ummah, or community of the faithful transcended old tribal boundaries and it made possible a degree of political unity undreamed of before Muhammad's time. The new religion provided a single and supernaturally sanctioned source of authority and discipline. With unity, the skills and energies that the Bedouins had once channeled up toward warring with each other were turned outward in a burst of conquest that is perhaps unmatched in human history in its speed and extent. From vassals, march warriors, or contemptible savages of the desert waste, the Arab Bedouins were transformed from the conquerors and rulers of much of the Middle Eastern world. The new religion also provided an ethical system that did much to heal the deep social rifts within Arabian society. Islam stressed the dignity of all believers and their equality in the eyes of Allah. It promoted a moral code that stressed the responsibility of the well-to-do and strong for poor and weak, the aged and infirm. Payment of the zakat, a tax for charity, was obligatory in the new faith. In both his revelations and his personal behavior, Muhammad enjoined his followers to be kind and generous to their dependents, including slaves. He forbade the rich to exploit the poor through exorbitant rents or rates of interest for loans. The Prophet's teachings and revelations of the Quran soon were incorporated into an extensive body of law that regulated all aspects of the lives of the Muslim faithful. Held accountable before Islamic law on earth, they lived in a manner that would prepare them for the Last Judgment, which in Islam, as in Christianity, would determine their fate in eternity. A stern but compassionate God and a strict but socially minded body of law set impressive standards for the social interaction between adherents of the new faith. Universal elements in Islam. Although only Arabs embraced the religion of Islam in its early years, from the outset it contained beliefs and practices that would give it a strong appeal to peoples at virtually all stages of social development and in widely varying cultural settings. Some of these beliefs, Islam's uncompromising monotheism, highly developed legal codes, egalitarianism, and a strong sense of community, were the same as the attributes that had won its support among the peoples of Arabia. Its potential as a world religion was enhanced by the fact that most of the attributes of Islam were to some degree anticipated by other Semitic religions, particularly Judaism and Christianity, with which Muhammad had contact for much of his life. He accepted the validity of the earlier divine revelations that had given rise to the Jewish and Christian faiths. He taught that the revelations he had received were a refinement of those earlier ones, and they were the last divine instructions for human behavior and worship. In addition to the beliefs and practices that had given Islam a universal appeal, its 5 pillars, principles that must be accepted and followed by all believers, provided the basis for an underlying religious unity. 1. The confession of faith was simple and powerful. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. The injunctions. 2. To pray facing the holy city of Mecca 5 times a day. And 3. To fast during the month of Ramadan, spelled Ramadan. Enhance community solidarity, and allowing the faithful to demonstrate their favor. 4. The zakat, or teeth, spelled Tithe, for charity, also strengthened community cohesion and won converts from those seeking an ethical code that stressed social responsibility and the unity of all behaviors. 5. The Hajj, spelled Hajj, I'm pretty sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, or pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca to worship Allah at the Kaaba, shown in figure 6.4, drew together the faithful from Morocco to China. No injunction did more to give Islam a universal character. The Arab Empire of the Umayyads. Many of the Bedouin tribes that converted to Islam renounced the new faith in months after Muhammad's death, and his remaining followers quarreled over who should succeed him. Although these quarrels were never fully resolved, the community managed to find new leaders who directed a series of campaigns to force those who had abandoned Islam to return to the fold. Having united most of Arabia under the Islamic banner by 633, Muslim military commanders began to mount serious expeditions beyond the peninsula, I'm going to reread that I'm going to start from, I'll reread the sentence. Okay. Having united most of Arabia under the Islamic banner by 633, Muslim military commanders began to mount serious expeditions beyond the peninsula, where only probing attacks had occurred during the lifetime of the Prophet and in the period of tribal warfare after his death. The courage, military prowess, and religious zeal of the warriors of Islam, and the weakness of the empires that bordered on Arabia, resulted in stunning conquests in Mesopotamia, North Africa, and Persia, which dominated the next 2 decades of Islamic history. The empire built from these conquests were Arab rather than Islamic. Most of it was ruled by a small Arab warrior elite, led by the Umayyads and other prominent clans. These groups had little desire to convert the subject populations, either Arab or otherwise, to the new religion. Consolidation and division in the Islamic community. The leadership crisis brought on by Muhammad's death in 632 was compounded by the fact that he had not appointed a successor or even established a procedure by which a new leader would be chosen. Opinion within the Muslim community was deeply divided as to who should succeed him. In this moment of extreme danger, a strong leader who could hold the Islamic community together was urgently needed. On the afternoon Muhammad died, one of the clans that remained committed to the new faith called a meeting to select a leader who would be designated as the Caliph, spelled Caliph, the new political religious successor to Muhammad. Several choices were possible, and a deadlock between the clans appeared likely, a deadlock that would almost certainly have been fatal to a community threatened by enemies on all sides. One of the main candidates, Ali, the cousin and son-in-law of Muhammad, was passed over because he was considered too young to assume a position of such great responsibility. This decision later proved to be a major source of division in the Islamic community. By 632, it appeared that a difficult reconciliation had been won by the choice of one of Muhammad's earliest followers and closest friends, Abu Bakr. Abu is spelled A-B-U, and Bakr is spelled B-A-K-R. Caliph from 632 to 634. In addition to his courage, warmth, and wisdom, Abu Bakr was well versed in the geological histories of the Bedouin tribes, which meant that he knew which tribes could be turned against each other and which ones could be enticed into alliances. Initially, at least, his mandate was very limited. He received no financial support from the Muslim community. Thus, he had to continue his previous occupation as a merchant on a part-time basis, and he only loosely controlled the military commanders. These commanders turned out to be very able. After turning back attacks on Mecca, the Islamic faithful routed one after another of the Bedouin tribes. The defeat of rival prophets and some of the larger clans is what were known as the Ridda Wars soon brought about the return of the soon brought about the return of the Arabian tribes to the Islamic fold. Emboldened by the proven skill of his generals and the swelling ranks of the Muslim faithful, Abu Bakr oversaw raids to the north of Arabia into the sedentary zones in present-day Iraq and Syria and westward into Egypt, map 6.1. The unified Boeotian forces had originally intended to raid for booty and then retreat back into the desert, but their initial probes revealed the vulnerability of the Byzantine and Persian empires, which dominated or ruled the territories into which the Muslim warriors rode. The invaders, also encouraged by the growing support of the Arabian Boeotian peoples who had been migrating into the Fertile Crescent for centuries. These peoples had long served as the vassals and frontier guardians of the Byzantine and Persian empires. Now they joined their brethren in a combined assault on both of them. Motives for Arab conquests. The Arab warriors were driven by many forces. The unity provided by the Islamic faith gave them a new sense of common cause and strength. United, they could stand up to the non-Arab rulers who had so long played them against each other and despised them as unwashed and backward barbarians from the desert wastelands. It is also probable that the early leaders of the community saw the wars of conquest as a good way to release the pent-up energies of the martial Bediouin. Wait, what? It's spelled Bedouin. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Anyway, of the martial Bedouin tribes. I'm going to reread that sentence because it's starting not to make much sense. It is also probable that the early leaders of the community saw the wars of conquest as a good way to release the pent-up energies of the martial Bedouin tribes they now sought to lead. See figure 6.5. Above all, the Bedouin, that's how that word is pronounced. If I was saying it wrong before, it's pronounced Bedouin. The Bedouin warriors were drawn to the campaigns of expansion by the promise of a share in the booty to be won if the rich farmlands raided and the tribute that could be extracted from the towns that came under Arab rule. As an early Arab writer observed, the Bedouins forsook their life as desert nomads, not out of a promise of religious rewards, but because of a yearning after bread and dates. The chance to glorify their new religion may have been a motive for the Arab conquests, but they were not driven by a desire to win converts to it. In fact, other than fellow Bedouin tribes of Arab descent, the invaders had good reason to avoid mass conversions. Not only would Arab warriors have to share the booty of their military expeditions with even larger numbers if converts were made, but Muslims were exempted from some of the more lucrative taxes levied on Christian, Jewish, and other non-Muslim groups. Thus, the vision of jihads, it's spelled Jihads, or holy wars, launched to forcibly spread the Muslim faith, which has long been associated with Islam in the Christian West, misrepresents the forces behind the early Arab expansion. Weaknesses of the adversary empires. One of the two great empires that had once fought for dominance in the Fertile Crescent transit zone, the Sasanian Empire of Persia, proved the more vulnerable. Power in the extensive Sasanian domains were formerly concentrated in the hands of an autocratic emperor. Autocratic is spelled Autocratic. By the time of the Arab explosion, the emperor was manipulated by aristocratic class that harshly exploited the farmers who made up most of the population of the empire. Zoroastrianism, the official religion of the emperor, lacked popular roots. By contrast, the religion of a visionary reformer named Mazdak, which had won considerable support among the peasants, had been brutally suppressed by the Sasanian rulers in the period before the rise of Islam. At first, the Sasanian commanders had contempt for the Arab invaders and set out against them with poorly prepared forces. By the time the seriousness of the Islamic threat was made clear by decisive Arab victories in the Fertile Crescent region and the defection of the Arab tribes on the frontier, Muslim warriors had broken into the Sasanian heartland. Further, Muslim victories brought about the rapid collapse of the vast empire. The Sasanian rulers and their forces retreated eastward to the face of the Muslim advance. The capital was taken, armies were destroyed, and generals were slain. When in 651 the last of the Sasanian rulers was assassinated, Muslim victory and the destruction of the empire were ensured. Despite an equally impressive string of Muslim victories in the provinces of their empire, the Byzantines proved a stronger adversary. See Chapter 9. However, their ability to resist the Muslim onslaught was impeded by both the defection of their own frontier Arabs and the support of the Muslim invaders received from the Christians of Syria and Egypt. Members of the Christian sects dominant in these areas, such as the Copts and Nestorians, had long resented the rule of the Orthodox Byzantines, who taxed them heavily and openly persecuted them as heretics. When it became clear that Muslims would not only tolerate the Christians, but tax them less heavily when the Byzantines did, these Christian groups rallied to the Arabs. Weakened from within and exhausted by the long wars fought with Persia in the decades before the Arab explosion, the Byzantines reeled from the Arab assaults. Syria, western Iraq, and Palestine were quickly taken by the Arab invaders, and by 640 a series of probes had been made into Egypt, one of the richest provinces of the empire, map 6.2. In the early 640s, the ancient center of learning and commerce, Alexandria, was taken. Most of Egypt was occupied, and Arab armies extended their conquests into Libya to the west. Perhaps even more astounding from the point of view of the Byzantines, by the mid-640s, the desert Bedouins were putting together war fleets that increasingly challenged the long-standing Byzantine mastery of the Mediterranean. The rise of Muslim naval supremacy in the eastern end of the Mediterranean sealed the loss of Byzantium's rich provinces in Syria and Egypt. It also opened the way to further Muslim conquests in North Africa, the Mediterranean islands, and even southern Italy, map 6.2 and figure 6.5. For a time, the Byzantines managed to rally their forces and starve off further inroads into their Balkan and Asia Minor heartlands. But the early triumphs of the Arab invaders had greatly reduced the strength of the Byzantine Empire. Although it survived for centuries, it was henceforth a kingdom under siege. The problem of succession and the Sunni-Shia split. The stunning success of Muslim armies and the sudden rise of an Arab empire diverted attention, for a time at least, from continuing divisions within the community. Although these divisions were often generations old and the result of personal animosities, spelled animosities, animosities, resentments had also begun to build over how the booty from the conquest should be divided among the tribal groups that made up the Islamic community. In 656, just over 2 decades after the death of the Prophet, the growing tensions broke into open violence. The spark that began the conflict was the murder of the third caliph, Uthman, by mutinous warriors returning from Egypt. His death was a signal for the supporters of Ali to proclaim him as caliph. Uthman's unpopularity among many of the tribes, particularly those of the Medina and the Prophet's earliest followers, arose in part from the fact that he was the first caliph to be chosen from Muhammad's early enemies, the Umayyad clan. Already angered by Uthman's murder, the Umayyads rejected Ali's claims and swore revenge when he failed to punish Uthman's assassins. Warfare erupted between the two factions. Ali was a renowned warrior and experienced commander, and his deeply committed supporters soon gained the upper hand. After his victory at the Battle of the Camel in late 656, most of the Arab garrisons shifted to his side against the Umayyads, whose supporters were concentrated in the province of Syria and the holy city of Mecca. Just as Ali was on the verge of defeating the Umayyad forces at the Battle of Siffin in 657, he was won over by a plea for mediation. His decision to accept mediation was fatal to his cause. Some of his most fervent supporters renounced his leadership and had to be suppressed violently. While representatives for both parties tried unsuccessfully to work out a compromise, the Umayyads regrouped their forces and added Egypt to the provinces backing their claims. In 660, Muawiyah, spelled M-U'-A-W-I-Y-A, the new leader of the Umayyads, was proclaimed caliph in Jerusalem, directly challenging Ali's position. A year later, Ali was assassinated, and his son Hassan was pressured by the Umayyads into renouncing his claims to the caliphate. In the decades after the Prophet's death, the question of succession generated deep divisions in the Muslim community. The split between the Sunnis is spelled S-U-N-N-I-S, who backed the Umayyads, and the Shia, or supporters of Ali, remains to this day the most fundamental in the Islamic world. Hostility between these two branches of the Islamic faithful was heightened in the years after Ali's death by the continuing struggle between the Umayyads and Ali's second son, Hussein, spelled H-U-S-A-Y-N. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. After being abandoned by the clans in southern Iraq, he had promised to rise in a revolt supporting his claims against the Umayyads. Hussein and a small party were overwhelmed and killed at Karbala in 680. From that point on, the Shia mounted sustained resistance to the Umayyad Caliphate. Over the centuries, factional disputes about who had the right to succeed Muhammad, with the Shia recognizing none of the early caliphs except Ali, had been compounded by differences in belief, ritual, and law that have steadily widened the gap between Sunnis and Shia. These divisions have been further complicated by the formation of a splinter sects within the Shia community in particular, beginning with those who defected from Ali when he agreed to arbitration. The Umayyad Imperium. After a pause to settle internal disputes over succession, the remarkable sequence of Arab conquest was renewed in the last half of the 7th century. Muslim armies broke into Central Asia, inaugurating a rivalry with Buddhism in the region that continues to the present day, map 6.2. By the early 8th century, the southern prong of this advance had reached into northwest India. Far to the west, Arab armies swept across North Africa and crossed the Straits of Gibraltar to conquer Spain and threaten France. Gibraltar is spelled Gibraltar. Although the Muslim advance into Western Europe was blocked by the hard-fought victory of Charles Martel and the Franks at Poitiers in 732, the Arabs did not fully retreat beyond the Pyrenees into Spain until decades later. Muslim warriors and sailors dominated much of the Mediterranean, a position that was solidified by the conquest of key islands such as Crete, Sicily, and Sardinia in the early decades of the 9th century. By the early 700s, the Umayyads ruled an empire that extended from Spain in the west to the steppes of Central Asia in the east. Not since the Romans had there been an empire to match it. Never had an empire of its size been built so rapidly. Although Mecca remained the holy city in Islam, under the Umayyads, the political center of the community shifted to Damascus in Syria. Damascus is spelled Damascus, where the Umayyads chose to live after the murder of Uthman. Uthman is spelled Uthman. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, though. From Damascus, a succession of Umayyad caliphs strove to build a bureaucracy that would bind together the vast domains that they claimed to rule. The empire was very much an Arab conquest state, except in the Arabian Peninsula and in parts of the Fertile Crescent. A small Arab and Muslim aristocracy ruled over peoples who were neither Arab nor Muslim. Only Muslim Arabs were first-class citizens of this great empire. They made up the core of the army and imperial administration, and only they received a share of the booty derived from the ongoing conquests. They could be taxed only for charity. The Umayyads sought to keep the Muslim warrior elite concentration in garrison towns and separated from the local population. It was hoped that isolation would keep them from assimilating to the subjugated cultures, because intermarriage meant conversion and the loss of taxable subjects. Converts and people of the book. Umayyad attempts to block extensive interaction between the Muslim warrior elite and their non-Muslim subjects had little chance of succeeding. The citified Bedouin tribes were soon interacting intensively with the local populations of the conquered areas and intermarrying with them. Equally critical, increased numbers of these people were voluntarily converting to Islam, despite the fact that conversion did little to advance them socially or politically in the Umayyad period. In this era, Muslim converts, Mawali, still had to pay property taxes and in some cases jizya, spelled Jizya, or head tax, levied on non-believers. They received no share of the booty and found it difficult, if not impossible, to get important positions in the army or bureaucracy. They were not even considered full members of the Ummah, spelled Umma, but were accepted only as clients of the powerful Arab clans. As a result, the number of conversions in the Umayyad era was low, but by far the greater portion of the population of the empire were the Dhimmi, spelled Dhimmi, or people of the book, as the name suggests. It was originally applied to Christian and Jews who shared the Bible with the Muslims. An Islamic conquest spread to other peoples such as the Zoroastrians of Persia and Hindus of India. The designation Dhimmi was necessarily stretched to accommodate the majority groups within these areas of the empire. As the early illustration of Jewish worship in Muslim Spain in Figure 6.6 shows, the Muslim overlord generally tolerated the religions of Dhimmi, although they had to pay the jizya and both commercial and property taxes. Their communities and legal systems were left intact, and they were allowed to worship as they pleased. This approach made it a good deal easier for the peoples to accept Arab rule, particularly because many had been oppressed by their pre-Muslim overlords. Family and gender roles in the Umayyad age. Broader social changes within the Arab and widening Islamic community were accompanied by significant shifts in the position of women, both within the family and in society at large. In the first centuries of Arab expansion, the greatly strengthened position of women under Islam prevailed over the seclusion and subordination that were characteristic features of women's lives through much of the rest of the pre-Islamic Middle East. Muhammad's teachings and the dictates of Quran stress the moral and ethical dimensions of marriage. The kindness and concern the Prophet displayed for his own wives and daughters did much to strengthen the bonds between husband and wife and the nuclear family in the Islamic community. Muhammad encouraged marriage as a replacement for the casual and often commercial sexual liaisons that had been widespread in pre-Islamic Arabia. He vehemently spelled Vehemently. He vehemently denounced adultery on the part of both husbands and wives, and he forbade female infanticide, which apparently had been widely practiced in Arabia in pre-Islamic times. Men were allowed to marry up to 4 wives, but the Quran forbade multiple marriages if the husband could not support more than 1 wife or treat all of his wives equally. Women could not take more than 1 husband. But Muhammad gave his own daughters a say to whom they would marry, and greatly strengthened the legal rights of women in inheritance and divorce. He insisted that bride price paid by the husband's family be given to his future wife rather than to her father. The Prophet's teachings proclaim the equality of men and women before God, and in Islamic worship, women, most notably his wife Khadijah, spelled Khadijah, were some of Muhammad's earliest and bravest followers. In the battle with the Meccans, spelled Meccans, women accompanied the forces on both sides, and a woman was the first martyr for the new faith. Many of the hadiths, or traditions of the Prophet, which have played such a critical role in Islamic law and ritual, were recorded by women. In addition, Muhammad's wives and daughters played an important role in compiling the Quran. Although women were not allowed to lead prayers, they played an active role in the politics of the early community. Muhammad's widow, Aisha, spelled Aisha, actively promoted the claims of the Umayyad party against Ali, while Zainab, Ali's daughter, went into battle with the ill-fated Hassan. Through much of the Umayyad period, little is heard of veiled Arab women, and a woman appeared to have pursued a great range of occupations, including scholarship, law, and commerce. Perhaps one of Zainab's nieces best epitomizes the independent mindedness of Muslim women in the early Islamic era. When chided for going about without a veil, she replied that Allah, in his wisdom, had chosen to give her a beautiful face, and that she intended to make sure that it was seen in public so that all might appreciate his grace. Umayyad decline and fall. The ever-increasing size of the royal harem was just one manifestation of the Umayyad caliphs' growing addiction to luxury and soft living. Their legitimacy had been disputed by various Muslim factions since their seizure of the caliphate. But the Umayyads further alienated the Muslim faithful as they become more aloof in the 8th century and retreated from the dirty business of war into pleasure gardens and marble palaces. Their abandonment of the frugal, simple lifestyle followed by Muhammad and the earliest caliphs, including Abu Bakr, who made a trip to the market the day after he was selected to succeed the Prophet, enraged the dissenting sects and sparked revolts throughout the empire. The uprising that proved fatal to the short-lived dynasty began among the frontier warriors who had fought and settled in distant Iran. By the mid-8th century, more than 50,000 warriors had settled near the oasis town of Merv in the eastern